The air on Okinawa is thick, a humid blanket woven from salt, jungle rot, and the metallic tang of cordite. For Private Kenji Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army, this air was the only thing left. His world had shrunk to a few square feet of mud, the deafening symphony of artillery, and the ghost of a promise he had made to his emperor. To die. He had been taught that capture was a fate worse than death. It was the ultimate stain upon one's family, one's ancestors, one's soul. The military field code, the Senjin-kun, was explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die, and so erase the fault of having been taken captive. If you believe these hidden stories from history deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. So when the American Marines swarmed his position, their faces smeared with grime and exhaustion, Kenji closed his eyes. He waited for the bayonet, the bullet, the final brutal punctuation mark to his short life. He had failed. Now he would pay the price. He had seen the propaganda posters. Leering American demons with fangs and claws, torturing helpless prisoners. This was the end he expected, the end he was promised. But the bayonet never came. Instead, a rough hand grabbed his collar. A voice, loud and guttural in a language he barely understood, yelled something. He felt his rifle being kicked away. He was hauled to his feet, his body screaming from hunger and fatigue. This, he thought, is just the beginning. The torture will be slow. The humiliation, infinite. He was one of over 100,000 Japanese soldiers who would surrender during the war. A number that, to the high command in Tokyo, was a statistical impossibility, a collective act of spiritual treason. To them, these men were no longer Japanese. They were ghosts, erased from family registries, declared legally dead. Their families would be denied pensions and honored with the false news of their heroic deaths in battle. The cruelest betrayal was not waiting for them in an American camp. It had already been committed by their own homeland. The journey from the front lines was a fever dream of disorientation. Kenji and a handful of other captured men were herded onto trucks, then ships. They were skeletons wrapped in tattered uniforms, their eyes hollow with the terror of the unknown. They did not speak. The shame was a physical weight, pressing the air from their lungs. Each glance from a young American guard was, in their minds, a prelude to violence. They were sailing east, into the heart of the beast. Weeks bled together, the salt spray, the endless horizon, the gnawing hunger. Finally, they reached the shores of America, the land of monsters. They were processed at Angel Island, California, then loaded onto a train with blacked-out windows. For days they rumbled across a country they could not see, a vast alien landscape they had been sent to conquer and destroy. Their destination was a place called Camp McCoy in a state named Wisconsin. The name meant nothing. It was just a word for hell. When they finally stumbled off the train, the first shock was the air. It was cool and crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth, not fire and decay. The guards were not the horned demons from the posters. They were young men, some barely out of their teens, with bored, tired faces. The first order of business was not the interrogation chamber. It was the showers. For men who had been living in mud and filth for months, the sensation of hot, high-pressure water was a violent, almost spiritual experience. It was a baptism they did not understand. They were scrubbed down, dusted with the lousing powder that stung their skin, and handed new clothes. Simple work fatigues, but they were clean. They were whole. Kenji stood there, steam swirling around him, his mind reeling. This was a meticulous, systematic process. But it was not the systematic process of torture he had been steeling himself for. It was sanitation. It was order. It was the first crack in the foundation of his reality. The real psychological demolition, however, was about to be served on a tray. Lined up in a cavernous mess hall, Kenji watched as American cooks in white aprons slopped food onto metal trays. He expected a bowl of thin gruel, a crust of stale bread, just enough to keep them alive for the next round of questioning. Instead, the first thing placed on his tray was bacon. Thick strips of it, fried to a perfect crisp, glistening with fat. Then came scrambled eggs, fluffy and yellow, and toast, with pats of real butter, and a mug of steaming black coffee. He stared at it. This was not sustenance. This was a breakfast. This was the food of the enemy's homeland, a symbol of their obscene abundance. He looked at the guards. They were not watching him with cruel anticipation. They were just eating their own. Hesitantly, he took a bite of the bacon. The explosion of salt and smoke and fat was a sensory overload. His body, starved for so long, reacted with an involuntary shudder of pure animal relief. He devoured it in seconds, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. Why? Why would they feed their prisoners, their sworn enemies, a feast? Was this a trick? A way to soften them up before the real pain began? A last meal before the execution he had been promised? Around him, the other Japanese prisoners were experiencing the same cognitive dissonance. Some wept silently as they ate. Some stared into space, their hands frozen over their trays. They had been prepared for brutality from the American beasts. They were completely, utterly unprepared for bacon. This was not war, it was something else, something far more confusing, and maybe far more dangerous. The bacon was not a trick, neither were the eggs. The next day, there was oatmeal with brown sugar and milk, then sausage. Then pancakes with a thick, sweet syrup that coated the tongue. The assault was relentless. It was an invasion of calories, a campaign of comfort. This was the American strategy, a calculated policy known as benevolent treatment. It was rooted in the Geneva Convention, but it was also a powerful form of psychological warfare. If the American demons fed you pancakes, what other lies had your government told you? The food was just the beginning. The days at Camp McCoy unfolded in a slow-motion sequence of surreal paradoxes. One afternoon, the guards brought out bats and leather gloves. They taught the prisoners a game called baseball. Kenji watched, bewildered as men who were once his mortal enemies explained the rules of innings and outs. Soon, fierce rivalries developed between the barracks. For men raised on the rigid principles of martial discipline, the fluid, strategic grace of the game was a revelation. It was a competition, yes, but it was a game. The consequence of failure was not death or dishonor. It was just the end of an inning. The small comforts were the most disarming. A guard handed Kenji a curved glass bottle, condensation slick on its sides. Inside was a dark, bubbling liquid, Coca-Cola. He drank. The fizz and alien sweetness was a shock. It was one of over 5 billion bottles the company would produce for the war effort alone. A trivial luxury that spoke of an industrial power he could not comprehend. Then came a strange, sticky brown paste. Peanut butter. The prisoners stared at it, unsure if it was a sweet or a savory. They spread it on bread, their confusion slowly turning to a quiet, addictive pleasure. On weekends, they were shown movies. They sat in the dark and watched impossibly beautiful people dance and sing on a giant screen. The sounds of American jazz, a music of chaotic joy, filled the hall. Kenji felt a profound absurdity. Back home, his family believed he was a divine spirit, a fallen warrior enshrined at Yasukuni. Here, he was tapping his foot to the sound of a trumpet. Of course, it was not a holiday. They worked, often on local farms, shocking the nearby communities who had been told the Japanese were subhuman savages. One Wisconsin farmer later recalled, "The men who came to my farm were polite, quiet, and worked harder than anyone I had ever hired." The International Red Cross visited the camps regularly. Their reports documented everything: the clean barracks, the medical facilities, the diet. A delegate noted that prisoners at Camp McCoy received a daily ration of over 3,000 calories. That was nearly double what a soldier in the Imperial Army received on the front lines. It was 3 times what a civilian was allotted in firebombed Tokyo. The enemy was feeding them better than their own homeland was feeding their families. If you find this hidden side of history as shocking as they did, take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge what we think we know. This realization was the cruelest weapon of all. It was a knife in the gut. They were safe. They were well fed. They were playing baseball. Meanwhile, their loved ones were starving and dodging American bombs. Their enemy was showing them mercy, while their own government had abandoned them. The question of honor became a daily, internal battle. Was it more honorable to starve for an emperor who had discarded you, or to eat a sandwich offered by the man you were supposed to kill? Not every prisoner accepted this new reality. Some remained defiant, clinging to the Bushido Code as their only anchor in a sea of confusion. They saw the good treatment as a sophisticated form of torture, designed to break their spirit. They organized secret military drills in the dead of night, a ghostly pantomime of a war they had already lost. But for many, like Kenji, the change was slow and profound. The war for the soul was waged not with bullets, but with chocolate bars and bottles of Coke. The silence from home was the loudest sound in the camp. Mail was rare. When it did arrive, it was a window into hell. A letter for a man in Kenji's barracks described the firebombing of his city. His entire neighborhood, his family, his past, had been turned to ash. The man read the letter, then calmly folded it. That afternoon, he played baseball. He hit a home run. As he ran the bases, his face was a blank mask. Kenji realized the terrifying truth. Their shame was not in being captured. Their shame was in surviving. This prison was not a punishment. It was a sanctuary, a bizarre paradise where they were safer, healthier, and more free from hunger and fear than their own families. Their dishonor was their salvation. The days at Camp McCoy found a rhythm. Breakfast, work on a farm, baseball in the afternoon, sleep. It was a life of a kind. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a dull, comfortable acceptance. The men gained weight. Their skin, once sallow, now had color. They learned the names of American baseball players. They could distinguish the taste of different kinds of pie. They were becoming experts in the culture of their enemy. And then, the Americans changed the curriculum. One evening, they were led not to the movie hall, but to a classroom. A projector was there, but also a chalkboard. An Nese translator stood at the front, his face impassive. He did not speak of honor or surrender. He spoke of steel. He wrote a number on the board. It was the monthly American output of steel, in tons. The number had too many zeros for Kenji to comprehend. Then he wrote Japan's number next to it. It was a puddle next to an ocean. He did the same for aircraft carriers, for oil production, for bullets. There was no lecture, no propaganda speech, just the numbers. Cold, silent, brutal mathematics. The war was not a clash of spirits, as they had been told. It was an industrial equation, and they were on the wrong side of it. The men sat in stunned silence. Their divine mission had been a logistical impossibility from the start. They had been sent to fight a typhoon with a bucket. The next lesson was at the movie screen. They filed in, expecting a comedy. The lights dimmed. The film that flickered to life was not from Hollywood. It was grainy, shaky newsreel footage. The images were of Chinese civilians being bayoneted by Japanese soldiers, of Filipino and American prisoners on a death march, their bodies skeletal, their eyes vacant. It was the rape of Nanking. It was Bataan. It was their army, their comrades, their brothers. This was the divine conduct they had been sworn to uphold. Kenji watched a Japanese officer laugh as he swung his sword. He felt a sickness rise in his throat, a shame deeper and more corrosive than the shame of his own capture. The American demons from the posters were real, but they were wearing his uniform. The final blow was quieter, more personal. The camp authorities began distributing translated copies of letters taken from the bodies of dead Japanese soldiers on the front. These were not official reports. They were last words to mothers, wives, and sons. They spoke not of glory, but of maggots in their rice, of officers who stole their rations, of a desperate, gnawing hunger. One soldier wrote to his wife that he dreamt of her sweet potato soup more than he dreamt of victory. The propaganda of the benevolent enemy was one thing. The propaganda of their own nation, now exposed as a monstrous lie, was something else entirely. It was a total demolition of the soul. With their purpose gone, their honor stained, and their faith shattered, a new kind of enemy entered the camp. It was despair. A man in the next barracks was found one morning. He had used his own belt, hanging himself from a water pipe. It was not a defiant act of Bushido. It was a quiet surrender to emptiness. 2 others tried to slit their wrists with sharpened spoons. The guards found them in time. The Americans, in their methodical way, increased the watch. They offered counseling from a chaplain who spoke through a translator. Kenji watched this wave of self-destruction with a cold dread. He understood it. To die on Okinawa for the emperor was one thing. To die in Wisconsin because you no longer knew what to believe in was another. He saw the men playing baseball now, and the movements seemed slower, heavier. The game was no longer a novelty. It was a lifeline. It was a set of rules in a world that had none. It was a reason to get through the day. To endure was no longer a failure of the will to die. It was an act of defiance against the void. It was a new kind of honor, forged not in sacrifice but in survival. The seasons turned. The crisp autumn air gave way to the deep, biting cold of a Wisconsin winter. The men learned about snow. They learned about frostbite. They learned about the quiet beauty of a world blanketed in white. They endured. Then one morning in August 1945, the routine broke. There was no call for work details. The guards were gathered in small, excited groups. An energy, electric and strange, filled the air. At 1000 hours, a voice crackled over the camp's loudspeakers. It spoke first in English, then in Japanese. The message was short. An imperial proclamation had been issued. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Kenji stood frozen in the center of the yard, the announcement echoing in the stillness. He looked at the faces around him. There was no joy, no relief, only a slow, dawning, absolute terror. Their strange sanctuary was gone. Their time as prisoners was over. Now they had to go home. The journey home was not a celebration. It was a slow, silent funeral procession across a vast ocean. The men who had learned the rules of baseball now sat staring at the waves, their minds replaying the cold mathematics of steel production and the grainy newsreels of their own army's atrocities. They were no longer soldiers of the emperor. They were not yet men of a new Japan. They were ghosts in transit, caught between a paradise they could not understand and a home that no longer wanted them. When Kenji finally stepped onto Japanese soil, the air was not thick with humidity and salt. It was thick with the dust of pulverized cities and the smell of ash. The abundance of America was a fever dream. This was reality. Charred timber, twisted metal, and the hollowed eyes of a defeated people. He found his family, or what was left of them, living in a lean-to built from salvaged scrap. His mother, her back bent from years of hardship he could not imagine, looked up as he approached. There was no cry of joy, no tears of relief. Her face was a mask of confusion, then a deep, soul-crushing grief, and finally, a flicker of shame. The hero she had been told to mourn had returned as a failure. He had not died. He had lived. In her eyes, he saw his own damnation. In the years that followed, Kenji and the other 100,000 returned prisoners became the unburied dead. They were a living embarrassment, a physical reminder of the nation's ultimate dishonor. They were denied jobs. They were ostracized in their own communities. Many never spoke of their time in the American camps. To mention the clean barracks, the warm clothes, the endless food, would have been an obscene insult to the suffering of their families. The memory of bacon and ice cream became a secret, a private shame buried deeper than the shame of surrender itself. The paradox was absolute. In America, they were prisoners of war. In Japan, they were prisoners of peace. They had survived the enemy's bullets only to be killed by their own nation's silence. They had been prepared for cruelty and had been met with kindness. They had expected to return to a land of honor and found only a wasteland of shame. Their true war had not been fought on the battlefields of Okinawa. It began the day they were handed a tray of food and were forced to question everything they had ever been taught to believe. The greatest shock of the war was not the atomic bomb. It was not the unconditional surrender. For men like Kenji, the greatest shock was mercy. It was a weapon more powerful than any explosive, for it did not destroy the body. It completely and irrevocably dismantled the soul. If this story of impossible survival and paradoxical honor has moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories. Let us know in the comments what part of their experience shocked you the most.